Hello, everyone. So here we have the lecture for Soul. So of course with Essay 2, which must be written about Soul or Pet Cemetery, you must identify one message the film imparts and explain how the film conveys that message as part of a rhetorical analysis. The first thing to consider with Soul is its genre, and how its genre is significant to its rhetoric. Now, in terms of genre, Soul might be called fantasy, and it is, of course, a Disney film. I do want to talk about Soul as a Disney film, considering its citational context, its place among other Disney films, and Disney is a category of film. We might even consider it a genre itself, because as we said in previous lectures, new genres emerge all the time. But before we consider Soul in the genre of Disney film, I wanted us to consider it in another genre that it belongs to, visionary fiction. Now, visionary fiction is relatively new as a genre. It wasn't really solidified as a genre until the early 2000s, and is sometimes considered a subtype of the science fiction genre. So visionary fiction deals with protagonists and stories expanding their consciousness. That is, finding some previously unknown esoteric or spiritual truth. So with that in mind, and if we consider Soul to be in this genre, we can infer that the protagonist Joe Gardner, and by extension we, the audience, are meant to gain some new insight about life after watching the film. So if you've seen Soul, I would say it's pretty explicit what the film's overall message is. It's trying to show us that life isn't about finding one's purpose, but enjoying and appreciating life's beauty day to day. One of the Jerrys even basically says as much in a conversation with Joe, Soul, near the end of the film. That said, I thought instead of stopping right there and saying, there's the message, we're done with this, it would be good for us to consider the film through two lenses. That is, looking at it from a certain point of view. So first we're going to look at it with COVID-19 in mind, and then we're going to look at it with diversity in mind, since the film was produced during the pandemic, and also Joe notably is the first black protagonist in a Pixar film, and also quite interestingly enough, he's a middle-aged protagonist as well, which we don't see a lot of in Disney. So now I want to start off by discussing the film's rhetorical situation. Now, this is important if you're writing the summary for extra credit, because you need to include this, and it of course is also important to know because it's relevant to the Essay 2 assignment. In the intro paragraph of Essay 2, you should explain the rhetorical situation of the film. That is, who is the communicator here? And that of course would be Pete Docter, the director. Who is the audience, do you think? What is the message being sent? Which is what you will have to say in your thesis. What is the message? And very important, what is the context behind this act of communication, this film, be it historical context or something else? In the case of this film, it actually was made during the pandemic, so there is some historical context. It tells us that it was made during the pandemic in the credits. That said, this clearly isn't a pandemic movie like movies like Contagion are, but I'd argue that its message is relevant to the situation of COVID-19, and that Docter and his animators may have even had COVID-19 in mind when making the film. So let's look at that possible connection in a bit more detail. So the first thing I want to note is that the first thing we see in this film, besides Joe himself, is this writing on Joe's chalkboard. The title of the song his class is practicing is called Things Ain't What They Used to Be. Now that could be incidental, but given the film's historical context and given that it's one of the first things we see, that use of the verbal modality might just be a subtle or perhaps not so subtle acknowledgement of the state of the world right now. Things ain't what they used to be since COVID, in other words. So this isn't the only indication that the film might be directly connected to COVID. For example, we have this bottle of hand sanitizer on Joe's desk, also in the first scene. Hand sanitizer has become so ubiquitous in this pandemic, it's practically a symbol of it. Now you might be thinking, oh, Professor, you're crazy. You're in English major mode and you're looking for meaning where there is none. But to that, I'd say to you, consider that hand sanitizer turns up again in this film, and is even mentioned by name when Joe's soul sees his body in that hospital. Even just the fact that this film chooses to include a hospital might be an indicator of the filmmaker's consciousness of the pandemic, considering we often associate hospitals with COVID nowadays, considering everything hospitals have gone through during this, especially when they were overcrowded and in need of resources back in the pandemic's early days. But to be fair, it could just be a hospital, and the filmmakers could not be referencing the pandemic at all. However, I did want to point out one last thing, and that's Joe's father in this scene, when he and Joe are at the piano. There's this carefully placed IV pole in the foreground, which communicates that Joe's father died of some illness, probably. Of course, losing a loved one to disease is something that has become commonplace in this pandemic, unfortunately. So we could see this scene with Joe's ailing father as a reference to that current reality that we're facing. Still, Joe's father smiles in this scene, in spite of the situation of him being close to death. Of course, we're facing immense loss of life right now, and Joe himself even loses his life in the film, and he has to deal with that. And when I say loss of life, it isn't just literal loss of life or dying. Joe loses all his dreams and plans when he falls down that manhole. So it isn't just death that he contends with, it's his life plan being suddenly derailed. And that's exactly what COVID has done to us. It has brought us death, but it's also brought us an upending to all of our lives and our life plans. So in a sense, this film might be following the problem-solution structure that we talked about as applying to written text. The problem implicitly is COVID and how it affects our lives. Or even generally speaking, the problem is life happening, of shit happens, and what do we do when life throws us a curveball? How do we deal with that? What's the solution? Well, we said the film wants us to live life day by day and go with the flow, as it were. But let's take a closer look at how it achieves this message through its visuals, given that film is a visual medium after all. So one thing I wanted to note about this film is its extensive use of shapes to convey meaning. The director, Pete Docter, is known for using character designs that reflect the character's personality. Perhaps the most notable example of this is Carl and Ellie from Docter's earlier film, Up. Not only is Carl's face square and his body square, but also his chair, his lamp, etc. Ellie, in contrast, is round in her face, and all of her items are round or curved. Her chair, her lamp, etc. This serves to signify the difference between the two characters. If you've seen the film, you know Ellie is spontaneous and adventurous and flexible in life, whereas Carl is more cautious, more reserved, and overall more rigid, at least at the beginning of the film, before he goes on his adventure. If you've seen it. So given what Pete Docter has done with circles and squares before, it's probably safe to say that they carry similar meaning in this film. So let's take a look at how squares represent rigidity and circles fluidity in Soul. So we have Terry, who is the accountant responsible for counting all of Earth's souls, and she is squarish and squat in shape, as opposed to the Jerrys who supervised the Great Before. The Jerrys are taller and seem to move more fluidly and have more curves in their design, and they can even shapeshift. They are very fluid characters, in other words. And Terry's domain is a room full of giant blocky filing cabinets, whereas the Jerrys inhabit this pastoral setting in the Great Before, full of round, rolling hills. Terry also wants to get Joe into the Great Beyond and following with strict order, but Joe first needs to learn a lesson about life. And the lesson truly is in divorcing oneself from strict plans, from divorcing oneself from strict plans and going with the flow instead. This is represented by circles. So circles define Joe's journey to understand the true meaning of life. He falls through a circular manhole to begin his journey, and his journey ends with him free falling through the circular Earth portal. 22's journey toward appreciating life is defined by circles as well. She needs a circular Earth pass to get to Earth. Before she meets Joe, she's living in a box, so she's living a very rigid existence. She's boxed in, if you will, trapped, unable to appreciate life. The box she lives in also leads into the place souls go to when someone gets in the zone. And after Joe tells her that just regular old living, which she experiences when she's in Joe's body, doesn't really count as a purpose, that's when she becomes a lost soul. And she feels like she's no good, and she has no direction or purpose in life. She is a lost soul at this point, and lost souls, as Moonwind tells us in the movie, are obsessed by something that disconnects them from life. I'd argue that this is a metaphor for depression, which of course many people are facing during this pandemic, wondering what to make of our lives in the pandemic's wake. What do we do now that we're in this totally different situation? The lost souls are buried under sand, and this serves to literalize what it feels like to be depressed, to be buried or even caught up in a sandstorm of emotions, as we see in the film when Joe's soul goes to save 22. It's like she's trapped in the middle of a storm. Thinking of use of color, I also don't think it's an accident. The sand is dark, in this case representing hopelessness, a lack of light, being trapped in a dark void, etc. It really contrasts with the pure white, unborn souls in the brightly lit great beyond, a realm dedicated to getting these souls prepared to live by showing them the brightness and joy in life. So light colors and round shapes definitely mean to represent life's beauty and how they are key, and how the key to appreciating life's beauty is through fluidity, through living a fluid life. Even the great beyond might be seen as a positive place, considering its entrance is round and it's bright white in color. So the film might also be saying we shouldn't fear death because it's an extension of life, the great beyond seems to be. I also think it's interesting that all the portals to the great before and that great beyond conveyor belt area are square, and that seems to suggest that these places, the great before and the great beyond conveyor belt, are just, holding tanks or in between places that people go to before they can experience life on Earth and whatever is afterlife in the great beyond. So life in the afterlife, whatever that might be in this film, it might not be heaven because, heaven and hell are kind of swept aside. But whatever the afterlife is, it's shown to be beautiful, with its round shape and its brightness, just like life. And they're shown to be beautiful, as we can see when we are fluid, as opposed to when we are rigid. We can't see life's beauty and the afterlife's beauty. Joe initially didn't want to go to the great beyond if we are in a rigid mindset as opposed to a fluid mindset. And then we also have all of those items that 22 collects when she's learning about life's beauty when she's in Joe's body. They're all round, if you noticed. The pizza, she sees fireworks when she eats pizza, just like Joe's having his flashbacks, remember seeing fireworks and what a beautiful life moment that was, as simple as it was. The lollipop is round, that she eats while talking about life in the barber's chair. Even the half-eaten bagel she donates to the guitar player is round or curved. And the spool, Joe's mom's spool, is round as well. And then there's that leaf, which I think warrants its own discussion. So now I want to discuss plants and nature in the film. Something about plants as a symbol, and I also talked about this in regard to that Twilight Zone, the movie segment, is that they represent growth. And that's what living one's best life is all about. Growing, adapting, going with the flow, being fluid as opposed to rigid, etc. The leaf that 22 sees falling from the tree is probably the film's most important symbol. It represents life as a cycle, with the leaf falling and the tree that shed that leaf preparing to grow new leaves. life as an unpredictable journey with the leaf being carried by the wind. I think it's notable that we also see plants in the hospital in the form of these paintings in the hospital rooms. I know you're probably thinking that those are just there for decoration, and I'd think so too if it weren't for the fact that some more pictures of plants show up during the scene where Joe, through 22, confronts his mother about how he doesn't want to live a rigid, meaningless life. And then she comes to accept him following his dream to become a musician. So she grows out of being in a rigid, overly practical headspace, just like how plants and flowers grow. And I think that's why those pictures are on the shelf. And the pictures of flowers in the hospital might just be placed there to tell us to continue to grow and adapt in the face of COVID. Nature, more broadly speaking, is also an important symbol of appreciating life in the film. We have Joe and his mom standing on a beach in a flashback, for example. The light-colored sand next to the tranquil ocean really contrasts with the dark sands that cover the lost souls. The blue water washing over Joe's feet reminds me of Joe being awash with blue while he's playing his music early in the film. As we said, blue is often a color representing peace and tranquility, which is ultimately what one attains when one learns to be fluid in life and not worry about strict plans and goals. Dorothea Williams even invokes that image of an ocean when she tells Joe the story of a fish wanting to be in the ocean and thinking that what he's in right now is just water. We all want to be in that ocean of happiness, surrounded by that peaceful blueness, but we can't find it by going out and looking for it, in other words. I think it's also significant that Joe's father's suit is blue. Joe's father found that peacefulness, that happiness, by doing what he loved and going with the flow instead of worrying about holding down a job and stuff of that nature. And Joe ultimately, or a more stable job, I should say. A musician is a job. And Joe ultimately learns to do that as well, as symbolized by the fact that he wears his father's suit at the end. I also think it's not an accident that Joe's mother has this sign saying sewing mends the soul, because that's what she does by mending the suit. She prevents Joe from becoming a lost soul by helping him do what he loves and go with the flow of that ocean of life, as it were, floating in that ocean of life. All right. And that leads us to pinpointing the film's message, which we have already said. But it is that we should live life day by day, go with the flow, and not worry about rigid plans. That's definitely relevant now during the pandemic when pretty much all of our lives have been upended, and I think the film really is trying to steer us away from becoming depressed, from becoming lost souls, because our plans aren't what they used to be. And we really see that in the end of the film when Joe is actually not completely satisfied with life after playing with Dorothea Williams, though he said he could die a happy man after playing with her. So life has boundless possibilities and so much to offer, and we need to recognize that, even in hard times, the film seems to say. Alright, so now I want to turn to talking about diversity and this movie as a Disney film, because I think that's significant as well. We might ask, what message is this film trying to send about Disney films? Because I think this film is rather subversive as a Disney film, and its rhetoric might involve trying to get us to think differently about what Disney even means, or includes as a genre, because many Disney films are self-aware nowadays, if you've noticed. We might consider something like Frozen, which really tried to subvert Disney's typical fairy tale structure by having the prince be the villain, having the love of sisters save the day instead of romantic love, etc. So Soul also tries to go against what Disney films are typically known for. It really totally subverts the whole typical Disney story. We all know Disney princesses or young Disney protagonists begin their movies by having a dream, be that being part of your world, like Ariel, or wanting so much more than this provincial life in Belle's case, and so on. But with Joe, once his dream is fulfilled, he doesn't embrace it. Rather, he embraces life and all its curveballs and twists and turns, and that subversion of the genre of Disney film and what typically happens in Disney films really helps drive home the movie's message. Because of course, typical Disney is all about when you wish upon a star, your dreams come true. But maybe dreams coming true isn't all it's cracked up to be. So yes, the film is very aware of its genre as a Disney movie, and is using its genre to forward its rhetoric. You really pay attention to how this is different than typical Disney movies, and that helps the message really stick with you. So Joe is also not your typical Disney protagonist in that he is middle-aged, and the only other Pixar protagonists who are middle-aged I can think of are Mr. and Mrs. Incredible. But Joe is kind of different in that he's not a superhero, he's just your average Joe. Honestly, that might be why he's named Joe. He's meant to represent just your ordinary person who has dreams but who has to work a day job. Like, who can't relate to that? He isn't like Merida, who has dreams besides being a princess, to say it another way. His age really helps ground him in a story that is about everyday life, basically. Because it would be someone at Joe's stage in life, in the real world, who'd be concerned about his dreams never being fulfilled. It's sort of a midlife crisis type situation, if you will. And of course, Joe is also the first black Pixar protagonist. Of course, nowadays, the film industry is all about being more inclusive in casting and representing more minority groups, as I talked about when discussing Pet Sematary. So the choice to make him black could simply be a reflection of that, though I think it's interesting when you consider another rhetorical situation surrounding this film, and that would include the film's historical context of Disney's trend of turning people of color into animals. For example, Cusco, of Latin American origin, turns into a llama, and of course Tiana, Disney's first black princess, spends most of her film as a frog. And there is some controversy surrounding this, and many reviewers of the film mentioned it actually. The idea is that this trope of turning non-white characters into animals perpetuates unflattering stereotypes, linking non-white people and their cultures to magic, animism, which is basically worshipping rocks and trees and nature, etc. And ultimately maybe suggesting that these people from these cultures are like animals or are primitive, which is quite offensive. Now, Disney has been trying to erase racist parts of its past, especially currently. They recently announced that they are retheming Splash Mountain to Princess and the Frog. They announced this almost immediately after George Floyd, when several companies were trying to be more racially sensitive. I don't think it's an accident they chose Princess and the Frog, because it's replacing Song of the South for Splash Mountain's theme. Now, you probably don't know what Song of the South is, because Disney has been trying to bury it for decades. But it's seen as controversial because it appears to glamorize slavery and the antebellum South. But I think it also represents Disney trying. But I think this change in the ride also represents Disney trying to bring Tiana more to the forefront, because they might be aware that people have been upset that her representation and experience as a black woman were kind of dashed because she spends so much time as a frog in her movie. And that brings me to the next place, which is the film's take on black culture. It definitely portrays it positively, really highlighting jazz as an important black contribution to American culture. Joe's father even identifies it as such in the flashback where he's introducing jazz to Joe. Something I got to thinking about also is the fact that this is one of few times race is directly acknowledged in a Disney film. If you've seen Princess and the Frog, I don't think they say the word black in a racial context even once. It's almost like this fairy tale-like world where race clearly exists, but where it doesn't exist as an issue. In that movie, we have things like Tiana's mother, Eudora, sitting in the back of the bus, but we get no talk about segregation or racism or anything like that. It's almost like the movie wouldn't have been different if Tiana weren't black at all. So Soul tackles race differently in that it's acknowledged. One of the funnier lines in the film is when Joe says 22 sounds like a middle-aged white lady, and that's an acknowledgement of race. And jazz is referred to as a black contribution to American culture. So definitely a step forward from Princess and the Frog, with race being explicitly acknowledged, just as an everyday reality. The only other time Disney ever really acknowledged race in the past is when they couldn't avoid it. Like with Pocahontas, which explicitly references white men coming into a Native American space, etc., because they can't just avoid stating white men. But here, race is acknowledged just as a part of life. As the film suggests it should be. We should just know, we should just recognize racial differences, because that's important in the road to equal representation. And we shouldn't, be colorblind, like Princess and the Frog might be seen as being. But yes, Joe is definitely portrayed positively as a black man, being hardworking and passionate, even if not the most affluent. His situation reflects many people's situations, like we said, but his situation could also be seen as reflecting the black experience in his struggles to move up in the world because of his position in society. Even though I will concede racism itself is never addressed in the movie. But Joe still turns into an animal, like usual in Disney movies. A cat in this case. This is kind of different, though, in that other non-white characters turned into animals specific in other Disney movies turned into animals specific to their region or culture, as if to say that these characters are tied to their cultures and regions to the point where they aren't individuals. That's even true with the one white person in Disney who turns into an animal, Merida's mother. She turns into a bear. Bears are in her geographical location. So we could see that movie, Brave, as Pixar trying to subvert the trope, but the whole situation in that film of Merida's mother turning feral kind of undermines it, because it might imply that white people turning into animals is horrific because they begin to lose personhood, whereas when someone of color turns into an animal, it might be seen as in these movies as perfectly natural, quote unquote, giving the really unfortunate and offensive implication that such characters are like animals anyway. But a cat isn't tied to any culture, so we have a subversion of the trope there. It isn't tied to any one culture. And I honestly wondered if they chose a cat because cats are thought to have 9 lives, which goes along with the message of not following one path or living just one life. Definitely something to consider. Nonetheless, cats are still often associated with magic, if we think to cultural knowledge. Witches often are accompanied by cats. So the film could be relying on that old trope of non-white characters being associated with magic and animism, which is something I talked about is also cropping up with Victor Pascal and Pet Sematary, if you want to catch that discussion in the Pet Sematary lecture. Alright guys, so that's what I have on Soul, and this final slide really serves to summarize my thoughts. It was released in late 2020, post George Floyd and during COVID. With those contexts in mind, I'd definitely say it means to make us think differently about life and think differently also about Disney and its typical messages about following one's dreams, and also Disney's tendency to sidestep race as an issue. So definitely be thinking about what this film has to say about life, Disney, race, or whatever else you think the film is speaking on if you want to write about it, because you are tasked with discovering the message of this film when you're writing the paper. Alright guys, thank you so much. Have a wonderful spring break. Let's write this essay, and I'll see you next time.